Yeah, let's see here. So we have a little bit of time that we're going to share with you guys. We had some last minute schedule changes and whatnot. So have a little bit of time that we're going to share with you guys. I think we're going to go through kind of like tips and tricks of building slash kind of the do's and don'ts of design and whatnot that we'll cover over this next little section here. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up and start sharing it. So give me a second. Here we go. All right. There we go. All right, you guys. So like I said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and share the do's and don'ts of kind of tiny house design and kind of the best tips and tricks. Also, more than happy to cover any and all kind of building questions and whatnot that you guys have as we go through this here. So let's see. Are you guys all able to see my screen here? Can drop it in the chat if you're able to see it, and then I'll get rolling here. Awesome. Thanks, Tamara. Cool. Thanks, Tammy and Dale and everybody. Cool. Yeah. So the tiny house designs, do's and don'ts. We can also cover some building tips and tricks as you guys are, asking questions or whatever. I know some of you guys have already kind of answered the question of where you're at with your building process and whatnot. But if you haven't answered the question yet, drop it in the chat. If you're DIYing your tiny house, where you're at in the process with DIYing your tiny house, and or if you are if you're in the design phase, the dreaming phase, the actual build phase, or if you're in the dwelling phase, if you're already living in your tiny house, and or if you're actually having a builder build your tiny home. I know that at least one person on here had a builder do it, and I think that's really cool that they're actually still taking the time to dive into a DIY and dwellers workshop like this or a full event like this so they can learn all the ins and outs that they still need to know. A lot of the stuff is still really important, even if you are going to be hiring a builder, because you don't want to actually just blindly hire somebody and not really actually know what they're doing and know what you're paying for. So yeah, Sammy, we're gonna have you speaking here. I think you're speaking tomorrow, so looking forward to that session. Okay, so first, don't mislead yourself. In a small home, especially on a budget, you can't have everything. There's always a compromise, so figure out what you want and implement it. So we always kind of I'm a numbers guy, so I like looking at it from the budget standpoint. And so what I like to do is, if you have a specific budget in mind, obviously you need to kind of just allocate a portion of the budget just for the standard structure, the trailer, the different things like that. But then once you kind of get to the more kind of fun part of the budget, I like to allocate my budget where I'm going to be spending the most time and where I think I'm going to get the most joy out of it there as well. So for example, things like the bathroom. I don't spend a ton of time in the bathroom, so I wouldn't allocate very much of my budget towards the bathroom, which also means I wouldn't allocate very much of my square footage of my tiny home to the bathroom. But the kitchen, I love a nice meal. I like being able to actually have space when I'm preparing a meal. And so I would definitely want to allocate a little more space and also probably a little more budget towards my kitchen to make sure that my kitchen has the specific necessary, appliances slash just the cabinetry and storage space that I'm looking for and whatnot. And kind of the same, you can take that same aspect and apply it across all the different parts of the tiny home. Make sure that you are allocating the appropriate amount of space to that specific area and also the appropriate amount of budget for that area as well. So you want to make sure that you're keeping those two things in mind as you're doing it. We can move along here. Another one that you want to keep in mind is how often are you going to be moving your tiny home? I know this is pretty standard, but a lot of people actually don't think really hard about this one. A lot of people are just like, I want it on wheels. I want to be able to move it around. But it's like, in reality, most people actually don't move their tiny home, and they actually only, or if they do, they move it like once every 3 or 4 years. It's like, don't worry too much about moving it if you're only going to move it once every few years, because you can easily hire any sort of towing company or a tow truck or like moving company or whatever to actually move your tiny home for you. You don't have to go buy a nice big truck. Like, some people are always thinking that they need to go buy a massive truck in order to get a tiny home. It's like, no, you don't need that. you don't even need to do it. Make sure that whoever tows your tiny home has the insurance, but also design it with that in mind. So we'll dive into it in just a little bit, but whether it's, if it's going to take a little bit more time to get your home prepared to move, that means like whether it's taking down specific lighting fixtures or making sure that your cabinets, you maybe even unload your dishes from the cabinet because you don't want all your dishes flying out. But if you are going to move your tiny home often, you don't want to have to do all that stuff. You don't want to have to take down a chandelier to move it. You don't want to have to secure the fridge every single time you're moving it. You don't want to have to tie everything down with straps and ropes and everything. You just want to be able to just pick up and go. So if you are going to move it often, make sure your cabinets are secured ones, kind of like an RV where they aren't just going to flop open. Make sure that you're using the appropriate, drawers and doors and everything along those lines, that your doors aren't just going to be swinging all around. Design with that in mind. So definitely important. All right, so maximize your vertical space. There's the big thing that everybody's been saying is don't go over 13'6", but you can, in certain situations, certain locations, you can actually go over 13'6", and when you do, it's actually not that expensive to get a permit in order to move down the road. Some places you actually don't need a permit and you can go clear up to 14 foot. Like in California, there's quite a few different locations in California. You don't need a permit. If you're going from point A to point B at all, you can literally tow down the road a 14-foot tall tiny home. But if you are going to be if you're going to be towing it, and that again kind of goes back to design it with it in mind, like, are you going to be moving it often or not? And if you're not going to be moving it very often, maximize your vertical space, go a little bit taller, and just make sure you know the rules of where you think you might ever take it in the future, and you know exactly what that permit fee would cost you. And don't go crazy. I'm not saying go to 16, 17 feet tall, but go to 14 foot, maybe even a little bit higher if you know your specific rules on your jurisdiction, where you're going to be. Because like I said, most people end up parking their tiny home and they never move it again. So you want to make sure you have that in mind. So, all right. Yeah, Colorado and Nebraska is 14'6". So that's literally a whole foot. You can go a whole foot taller without having to have a permit, or maybe you do need a small permit while you're there, but the permits are pretty cheap and you're going to move it once every once in a while. It's not like this crazy thing. If you do go too tall, that's when it starts getting a lot more expensive, because then you need like a follow car or like a lead vehicle and a follow vehicle, and they oftentimes have to have like the really tall poles just in case they hit a bridge or something like that. Then they can make sure that everybody stops and you don't bust a bridge down or something. But yeah, and then also the same thing with the width. Don't constrain yourself to 8'6". One of the biggest trends right now, actually, in tiny homes is people building tiny homes on wheels. That is, people building them wider than 8'6". And I know going from 8'6" to 10 foot wide doesn't seem like a lot of space, but that's actually a lot bigger of an inside space that you're actually getting, because it's literally an extra 1.5 feet wider. Because generally in an 8'6" tiny house, the inside walls are at least generally right around 7'6". So adding another 1.5 feet, that bumps it up so much. That's a huge percentage of actual usable additional inside space, and it can make your floor plan work out a lot better too. So don't restrict yourself there. Make sure you learn your rules before you actually just dive right in. Even though it's going to cost a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more expensive in some of these different things. Definitely make sure that you're at least looking at your options, because if you don't look at your options, you don't want to be stuck in an 8'6" tiny home when you actually wish that it was 10 foot or 12 foot or whatever it is. So do consider the resale value. Depending on what your end goal is and everything, you want to make sure that somebody's going to be able to purchase it from you in the future, which means not going like crazy unique, unless that's your end goal. If your end goal is just go crazy unique, go for it. But for the average person who's just wanting to make a good investment that they can sell later on down the road, consider the resale. So things like certification, that's huge. Make sure it's certified. You don't want to try to sell something that's not been certified. Sure, some people will buy it, but most of the time you're going to struggle selling it, and it's going to be, you're not going to get as high of a price for your tiny home, and it just kind of brings so many different questions. And like we say, don't ever buy something that's not been certified. So And if you are looking at something that's already been built and you're wanting to buy it used, but it's not certified, actually NOAA can do certification of already pre-built structures, pre-built tiny homes. So maybe he'll tune into that a little bit later today, but I wouldn't buy it and then try to get it certified. I would make the seller get it certified before you buy it. All right, don't overcomplicate it. Simple functionality is better than complicated functionality. We've in the past tried a ton of crazy triple, quadruple use furniture and, really different high tech, automation things and so on inside of the tiny homes. Like one tiny house we had, you push a button and it would literally slide the chandelier over while the table popped out of this kind of built up living room area, and it was like all at the push of a button, but it just didn't quite work as well as we want it to. It was pretty cool when it did work well, but it's one of those things that you're constantly going to have to be tinkering with it, and you don't want to overcomplicate the functionality of what you're actually doing. Just make it usable and you'll use it a lot more often. It's kind of what we found. So, all right, do consider built-in furniture. And it's oftentimes it's a way better way to utilize your space. And built-in furniture, maybe if it has like one or two, maybe three purposes, but for the most part, like built-in furniture, the really nice part is that it fills any vacant space. It can be a lot more designed to size, whereas some people will just get a couch and they'll stick it in their tiny home. But the average couch has like arms that are like this wide, anywhere from this wide on both sides, that you just lost so much seating space. Like get something that's going to actually fit your tiny house and maximize your space that way. Also with built-in furniture, and if it's a couch, you can design in storage inside of your built-in couch. So there's a lot of different ways that you can utilize custom built-in furniture there. All right. So this one, don't cheat. Actually, you guys, this is not cheating. You can totally use a storage shed. So many people kind of get this stigma of like, if you're living in a tiny house, everything has to fit in your tiny home. It's like, that's not necessarily true. Just get an additional place that you can store your non-used items. You're already probably going to be saving quite a bit living in your tiny home, and you don't want to, and you're going to be compromising in certain areas compared to just a standard regular size house. You're not going to want to compromise on getting rid of literally every single thing that you own and having to either go rent it whenever you need it or whatever the situation is. Especially as a DIYer, you're going to be having a lot of different tools and stuff like that. You're not just going to want to get rid of them when you're done. So go ahead and get a storage. And if you can match the storage to your house, that's a even bigger win there. So yeah, and build yourself an outside living space. Make sure that you kind of are thinking about the climate where you're living. Does it rain a lot? Then make sure it's covered. Whatever the situation is, there's a lot of extra space you can add to your tiny house by just going outside. It's a really good way to utilize the space that's already going to be there, but make it nice, make it livable, and it makes your entire tiny house feel a lot bigger and better. So get creative with what you design. We've seen too many people who just build literally a box, and we understand sometimes DIY, you're trying to either go as cheap as possible or just maximize the space and as functional as possible. But sometimes just that, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. If you just put in a little bit more work, if you put in 20% effort into making it nice and like actually curb appeal and so on, it actually adds a lot more value to your tiny house as well. And sometimes even if it's just a little bit more expensive to get a nicer siding or whatever it is, but long term it's going to end up paying off when you try to resell it, or if you end up using for a short-term rental or even a long-term rental, whatever it is. People want to, like I said earlier, you're already going to be compromising in some areas, so you might as well just make it nice as you possibly can. You can also try to find reclaimed material and different things along those lines as well to do that. So, all right, let's see here. Make it bright, light, and airy, which is kind of our way of saying like bring the outdoors in with a lot of windows. Make sure that the space doesn't feel like a box. The worst thing that you can do is build a small space and make yourself feel confined inside of a small little box like that. So make sure you kind of open it up, make it as airy as possible. So Um, don't forget about the vertical space. I already covered this a little bit, but most specifically, I mean lofts. Make sure that you utilize lofts for storage space. And if you need to hide clutter, if you have a lot of different just kind of storage space needed, you can put a door on the loft, or you can figure out some cool, unique way, like a curtain or something that goes across your loft, so that way you can actually block it off and you don't feel like you're constantly having to stare at all your junk inside of your tiny house. So do consider if you need stairs or a ladder. Who's going to be going up there, elderly or little kids. There are a lot of people who end up going with one or the other, and they regret their decision on the back end. And that's often a decision that's made based off of your end use. Are you going to be using the loft all the time for your sleeping area? Then it might be worth just going ahead and designing stairs into your space. But one of the kind of pro tips that we like to give people is partial stairs. So what if you do something like stairs that go halfway up, and then the first step is maybe either big, or maybe the first step you have to walk onto something. It's kind of like a mini ladder or something along those lines. Get creative with how you design your stairs and your steps or your ladder. But remember that when you do have a ladder, you need to find a place to be able to store your ladder too. And then also when you're storing your ladder, whoever's up in the loft can't get down. So you got to think about those different aspects as well. All right. Don't forget your priorities, your must-haves versus your wants versus your needs. A lot of people come to us and they don't have their ideas completely flushed out. They don't think through like what's a must-have, what is a want, and what's a need in their tiny home. And they oftentimes convolute it, and they prioritize things that aren't as important as others. So make sure that you're thinking through what is important for you and what is important for your end use case as well. And then stay organized. The best way to keep your house, whether it's a regular size house or a tiny house, clean and organized is having a home for each of your items. And what I mean a home for each of your items is, where do you store your keys? Where do you store your guitars? Where do you store your your laundry? Where do you store your dishes? All the different aspects of things, like where do you put your mail when you bring your mail in? Where do you put your shoes? All those different things. If there's no consistent place that you put that every single time, it's just going to feel cluttered and disorganized all the time. And every single time you go to clean up and you grab your pair of shoes, you're like, I don't know where to put these, and you're just going to try to find a new spot. Or when guests come over, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to make it look presentable? The most important thing you can do is have a consistent location, especially if you have a spouse or you're with your partner or whatever, and you are and you're sharing a space, or family or whatever, and you're both cleaning up, or two different people are cleaning up, and one person always puts it over here and the other person puts it there, and whatever it is, then you never know where it is, and or it's always just a new place every single time you go to clean up. That's not a great way. That's not a good system of cleaning or staying organized. So make sure that you have a good specific spot for each thing. And with that, you want to design your tiny house with that in mind. If you love guitars, make sure you have a spot for that. If you, whatever it is, make sure that you have a location for the different primary items that you're going to have. And then also kind of have like a catch-all area that catches the rest of your items that you might not think about, or maybe they're not as primary of an item. So don't create a tiny home that doesn't fit your design taste, but also don't forget that aesthetics don't always produce the most functional tiny home. We kind of covered this one a little bit, but functionality and aesthetics kind of can coincide depending on how you designed your tiny home. They can also be contradicting, so keep that in mind. See, don't use hallways. We encourage people to avoid hallways, because hallways always need to stay clear. That means that nothing can really be there, and they always need, they're just a passing space. And when you're talking about such a small square footage of space, you don't want a space that's not really intended for much other than just really passing through it. You want to be able to use your space in a way that is much more efficient and effective. So instead of doing a hallway, do what Jason and Damaris did, which is like your bathroom's the hallway. You already need to stand at your sink. You already need to stand at the toilet, whatever it is. You need to, but now if that's also your hallway and you're passing through there, that's a great double use of space. Where some people will put the bathroom on a side and the bedroom in the back, and then there's a small little hallway between the bathroom and walking along. And it just never is very, you can't utilize that space very well. So, sure, there's some few different things that you can do in hallways, but in general, you want to make sure that you're not wasting space like that. And just remember, each square footage is important. So let's see. Don't have don't have a built-in solar system. One of the things that so many people talk to us about, and if you listen to Patrick's session earlier, he was talking about like pretty much every single year, solar equipment is getting better, which means that the older stuff is getting cheaper. And so last year's model is cheaper now than it was last year. And same with this year's model is going to be cheaper than it is next year. And the battery technology, the solar technology, all of it is just getting better and better and better. Literally every single year, it's getting cheaper. And a lot of people are like, I need solar in my house, but they're not actually going to use it for the first year or two when they build their tiny home. What are they going to do once it's built in, and then 2 years later they could have gotten it for cheaper? Or the inverse is actually even more often, where somebody's going to be building a tiny home for the first year or two, they're not going to be plugged in to the grid and they need to be off grid, but after that they plan on being plugged into the grid. They just built and bought this whole solar system, built it into their tiny home, and then when it came time to no longer need the solar system, they can't just sell it. You can't sell it and piece it out. And then also, even if you do, you literally have a cavity there that sure you could probably use it for storage and whatnot, but that's just it's not going to be well designed for storage. So we highly recommend kind of the plug-in generators, the plug-in solar generator setup, where it's kind of, you can plug it in and then that way you can upgrade your system. It's really easy to get warranty on your system. It's just a lot easier in all those different ways. So, all right. Do design for your end use case. So example, like if you're in a short-term rental, if you're going to be using your tiny home to rent it out nightly, rather than considering don't just build in a lot of like storage. Don't build in a lot of wintertime storage for the summer, or summertime storage in the wintertime, because you don't really need it. People who are coming for just a couple of nights, sure, they'll have a bag with them and whatnot, but they're not going to be like trying to store stuff for summertime or store winter stuff in the summer. So you want to just make sure that you're designing with your end use case. You can also make it a lot more unique and put in those fine touches when you're looking to rent it out nightly. And that'll help you get a better return. So, something that is really important in short-term rental is make sure that it will show really well on photos and whatnot. So here's one of my pet peeves is don't put a fridge at the end of a cabinet run, especially like right in the front door. A lot of people, you'll open up the front door and the fridge will be right there in your face right here, which then it literally just blocks off the whole kitchen. It doesn't make it feel open or anything. Whereas if you put it at the end of the kitchen cabinet run way over there, that way you can, when you walk in right there, you have the whole cabinet right there, the countertop, you can just set your groceries right there, whatever it is, and it flows way further back. It makes the whole tiny home feel a lot more open. So think about that. Also, don't put stoves next to your fridge. You don't want to put them right next to each other, because oftentimes the stoves, the burners are pretty close to the edge, and you're literally either heating up your fridge, or some people have literally kind of melted parts of their fridge doing that. So don't forget about ventilation. You want to make sure that your bathroom is well ventilated. You want to make sure that your cooking is well ventilated, and just in general, especially if you're designing your tiny house to be as passive as possible, you're literally restricting any airflow, and that's such a small space that literally just your oxygen can start being used up over a certain amount of time. You want to make sure that it's got that nice flow exchange. Like even the session before this, they're talking about their EMV and I think they use the Lunos on it, and just have some sort of air exchanger. So don't overcrowd with decor. Less is more. When you're designing your tiny house, some people, try to bring in all their little knickknacks and everything. We always just say, like, part of the design of the tiny house, part of the aesthetic and the decor is basically the tiny house itself. So especially if you can have nice windows and you can face them in certain directions and whatnot, that'll bring in more light. And the fewer things that you have just everywhere, the more places that you have for homes for your items, the more places you can put your items away, the more full it'll feel. So do you consider privacy? Who's going to be living in the tiny house with you? Do you need 2 bedrooms? Is a loft going to be great or fine? Is there going to be, whatever the situation, the setup is, make sure that you're considering privacy inside your tiny home, but also privacy outside your tiny home. Are you going to feel like you're inside of a fishbowl when you're in your tiny home and literally all your neighbors can just look right in and see every single square inch of your tiny home? Or does it feel like you can actually, whether it's with curtains, block the tiny home windows, or maybe you can face your tiny home to where you're not actually just staring right into the neighbor's window, because nobody really likes that. Yeah, consider privacy on that there. And while you're doing it, consider custom plans. We do provide custom plans as well for tiny homes. We also sell tiny house plans, and we can at tinyhouseplans.com. You can go check it out by our tinyhouseplans.com. We can customize tiny house plans and whatnot. I think that when you're going tiny, having a design is pretty important and something that's going to be specific to what you are needing, and also keeping all these different aspects in mind as well. So yeah, it's kind of the general gist of all the designs there. You can hit us up for custom plans if you're looking for custom plans. And then I've almost done the whole 30 minutes. But yeah, if you have any other questions or anything, you can reach out to us, or if you're looking for plans, you can reach out to us there. I do have some questions inside the chat that I'm going to try to fly through real quick. So Bennett's asking about a tiny house on a foundation. So it really depends, and the difference in pricing versus a tiny house on wheels really depends on where you live and whatnot, Bennett. Most specifically, tiny homes on wheels are generally going to be cheaper depending on the different kind of aspects of your tiny home, with the caveat of and that's largely due to like system development charges and some of the different fees that you're going to have to pay, and just also the different challenges of getting your getting hooked up to the utilities, whether it's the electric or to sewer and so on, and to water. A lot of those different that can incur some fees there and so on. But in general, if you're talking about literally just the structure itself and everything above the everything above kind of the foundation or the trailer at that point, it's going to be probably pretty similar pricing, but with a little bit of exception that tiny homes are often built with just like 2x4 walls, whereas most like smaller ADUs or studios or whatever are going to need to be built with like 2x6 walls, and that's largely due to the requirements and the R value for the insulation, some different things like that. So there can be a little bit more rigorous requirements when you're building a regular home, depending on if you're trying to build your tiny house as a tiny house on wheels, or if you're looking to have it as an RV, or if you're looking to have it as more of like a residential house. There's different rules and regulations, but in general, if you're going to be building the same structure, it's going to be the same structure. The tiny house on wheels might add a little bit of complexity there and whatnot, but